So welcome back. This is a quick video to show you how to export audio in Cubase. Only the basics. I will do a more thorough video to show you file interchange formats, both importing and exporting things like OMFs and AAFs and other options you have in Cubase like track archives. Now, before I can do that, I just want to clarify some terminology. And I may have used this slightly loosely in some of the previous videos. And those terms are markers, range selections, and then the new one would be your left and right locators. Now, the range selection came in with a tool that I showed you. It's that tool over here, shortcut number 2, which allows you to select a certain range on a certain track or multiple tracks, but it isn't across all the tracks on your timeline. Now, the range selection, that is usually for editing purposes. I want to do offline processing just for that section, or I want to do some other kind of editing with that section. Like if I drag that section out, it cuts it out automatically from my range selection. So that's your range selection, which is the range selection tool. And the very latest version of Nuendo has now introduced a tool not dissimilar to Pro Tools, where your smart tool can do both of those things, range selection and normal object selection. But that's the first one. We have already covered markers. So markers, those are your marker tracks, and you can have those single markers like you have over here, the fix here, and then you have your cycle markers. That's the correct term, by the way. Your cycle marker is a marker that has a beginning and an end point. Now, the last one, that's the one that I didn't call correctly previously, but it's quite important to use this. That is your left and right locator. And that's the thing at the top here. When it is gray or purple, that's correct with an in and an out point. When it's orange, it shows you, you've actually got the left and the right back to front. That's negative space, so it won't do anything. Reminder, purple shows you that loop is on, gray shows you it's just going to play through it, and this can be used for multiple things like looping and ADR and stuff like that. But for this video, I want to show you how to use this left and right locator for export purposes. So let me zoom out to show you that. Again, very useful shortcut. If you select anything and hit P, it creates those left and right locators in the correct point. Obviously, if I cut a clip in half, it's only going to create it for that range. But for the projects you want to do, you generally want to export your audio to be exactly the same length as the video. So I select my video track, hit P, and create that. It might be that you want to export a very specific time range. Then you can either draw that in, or right at the bottom here, you have your left and right locator time code indication. So at the moment, it's going to go from 0 up to 4 minutes and 13 seconds and 14 frames. If I specifically know I want to export 2 minutes flat, then you can type that in and it will create that left and right marker for you. And you can drag this thing to a different position. I usually create specific 30 or 60 second ranges like that when I do music cuts for promos and trailers. For now, let's export all of this for example's sake. Now, there isn't a default shortcut in Cubase or Nuendo for exporting your mix. So that's one of the first ones I create. The one I like to use is Alt-Command-X, but that isn't default. I create that after the fact. And if you don't have the shortcut, obviously you have to go into a menu. So I'd like to show you your options in this menu. Make your selection, go to File, go to Export. And you can see here some other stuff I would like to talk about later. Very useful to export separate tracks or other type of files, but it's this audio mixdown that I care about. Again, a note on language. The typical terms you will find here would be render or bounce or mixdown. Mixdown is the term you find in Cubase and Nuendo, so I'll be referring to that. So in our audio mixdown menu, here you have it. Now later on, when we get to complicated templates, we start using multiple exports. And that's why we create these group channels, so that I can say, I want to export all of these guys separately. Very useful. You can do that in Pro Tools if you have Ultimate. Then you can add multiple exports at the same time. But you can do that in this version of Cubase already. But for now, I just want to do a single export, a single mix down, everything mixed together. Now, you can still do that for specific channels or specific groups, but it defaults to your output channels, my stereo out, which is what I want to export in this case. Also, you can do very interesting exports, exporting all your cycle markers differently. If you're working in a game audio project, then you have lots of different sounds that you might want to export. This becomes quite useful. I use this for projects that have lots of small bits, like audiology research, where there's hundreds of test words. I label them all properly, and then I export by cycle markers. But more about that later on. Let's just do our proper stereo export for now. Most of this is pretty self-explanatory. I don't have to go through this. The name, where you want it, a preview of the name. It has a preview because you might want to build some naming scheme. And this is more useful when you do bulk exports and batch exports. That's why it has the preview. Now, if there's a file conflict, do you want to override? Do you want to ask? Do you want to create a new file name? It'll ask you what to do. But this file format part is the important section as usual. Now you'll notice when I change my file type, the options I have under file type settings change, obviously, because you have different types of settings for MP3s compared to WAV files, as you can see. So let's look at WAV first. File type, sample rate, bit depth, pretty self-explanatory, and you can see you've got a lot of options here. Now, if you want to force the stereo mix into a mono, you have to say mono down mix. Now, even if you just have one single mono voice recording, if you set up the project to be a stereo project with your stereo out, it is going to do a dual mono with that same file on both sides, which is desirable in a lot of cases. But sometimes true mono is desirable, so you want to have just that one channel, smaller files, and other purposes, then you select this. But don't choose this if you actually do want a stereo mix. You'll see this project that I've created for you is a stereo down mix because that's the easiest for me for YouTube, because with the reverb and things that I add, there's a bit of stereo information, even though most of my voice is just mono. So I'm going to leave that unticked. Now, the other option that can be quite useful is the split channels. Don't use it very often, but it's going to export your stereo mix, and you'll just have two separate mono files for left and right. I hardly ever need this for stereo exports, but when we get to our surround sound stuff, this becomes useful because sometimes you do have to deliver all of your surround channels as separate files. Then you enable this. And you can see when you enable that, it shows you how it's going to name those different split files. Also going to leave this off for now. Now, some dedicated wave settings. I'm not going to talk about BWFs, broadcast wave chunks, and other things like that, but there are additional settings that you can have for wave file exports. If you leave this to this default, no problem for most of the things you want to do. And innuendo, this box has a useful extra bit here where you can normalize to a certain loudness level, which we will cover in finishing techniques. With export options, it defaults to what Pro Tools would call an offline bounce. So the real-time export, as the name suggests, will play through your timeline in real time. I never do that. I check my projects in real time, but then I export after that. And you can see the exporting is quite quick, depending on your buffer size, depending on the kind of plugins and instruments that you've got loaded. So I will not recommend that you put that on. And after export, you can say what happens to the file. Again, the defaults are fine here, but you can create a new project. You can automatically have that export be imported into your project. Useful if you want to do that, if you want to create a mix down for something you want to reuse in the project. Some people I know also do this, adding it as an audio track because they want to visually check their mix. They do the mix of the episode, they re-import it, it's in the right place according to the video. Don't just play back because then it's going to be double or processed in some way, but you can visually check whether there's gaps in there or whether something doesn't look quite right. It is actually quite a useful step to do, but for today I'm going to leave all of these unticked. And there's other stuff you can do. You can automatically publish to places. You can automatically open it in wave editors if you're a mastering engineer. I'm going to do nothing after this export. And just to give you an idea, obviously this computer doesn't have to work very hard to export a 4-minute wave file with almost no processing. So you'll see it's not fan noise. Wonder what that was for. Cubase export test to the desktop is fine for now. and I am going to export the audio. And as you can see, it's quite a quick process. And there we have our exported audio. I've got this keep dialog open, that's why it popped up again. Now, one of the nice features I find with this export mixdown is I've got it open, I've typed in all the names I want. I remembered actually I still wanted to mute something or change something. I don't have to close this to do stuff and lose my names. This dialog box doesn't overwrite you being able to do stuff in the program, so you can totally still change things, keep it open, or for quick and dirty exports, keep it open, mute and solo and change things as you want and keep on exporting. Now it will default to that left and right locator. Unlike Reaper, it doesn't do entire project. You don't have to specify that. You have to give it the range you want to export, which I do think is a bit more sensible, because projects and what you want to export, in my opinion, is hardly ever exactly the same thing. So that is a standard wave export. Just to give you some other options that you have here: AIF, CNF, different versions of that, MP3 that you might use. By default, this does not have an AAC or an MP4 export, but you can see FLAC here, very useful. Free lossless audio codec. I use that for archival, exactly the same lossless quality as WAV files, but about half the size, which is useful. But look, MP3s are still with us, and they're useful for drafts, and they're useful for certain things, and it's a high quality MP3 encoder that goes up to the normal 320 kilobits per second. Sample rates can also be set. You'll notice that if you enable a high quality mode, it grays out the sample rate, because high quality mode treats the encoding in a slightly different way. And the ID3 tag, again, that's your metadata of an MP3, which you can set. And if you don't, and you say insert ID3 tag, everything's going to be whatever defaults to here, which is in this case 2018 blues. So untick that or enter what you want here if it's useful. This really does apply more to music than to audio post-production. So I'm going to untick that. And that's basically it, but tune back in when we discuss some of the more advanced features, especially when we look at surround delivery and the different types of things you want to export here in terms of multiple export and cycle marker exports.